On the night of August 9, 1942, just 2 days after American Marines landed on a jungle island most of them had never heard of before that summer, sailors offshore watched 4 Allied cruisers sink beneath the waves in the space of little more than an hour, one of the worst single defeats in the history of the United States Navy. The Marines who had just gone ashore on Guadalcanal woke up the next morning to a stunning and terrifying reality. The ships that were supposed to keep them supplied, reinforced and connected to the rest of the war, had been driven off, and they were, for all practical purposes, alone on a jungle island, surrounded by an enemy that outnumbered them and controlled the surrounding seas. What followed was 6 months of the most grinding, desperate combat of the entire Pacific War up to that point, fought not just against Japanese soldiers but against starvation, malaria, and a level of physical deprivation that led the men who survived it to give the island a bitter nickname of their own. This is the story of what happened to the Marines who survived Guadalcanal, and how a campaign that began as a hasty, under-resourced gamble became the turning point that started the long push toward Japan. Here is the question worth carrying through this story. How do you hold a jungle airfield for 6 months when the Navy that put you there has been driven away, your supplies are running out, and nobody back home is entirely sure you can actually be reinforced in time? The strategic stakes behind the decision to move so quickly reflected genuine anxiety within the American command structure about how far and how fast Japanese expansion across the South Pacific might continue if left unchallenged. An operational airfield on Guadalcanal, positioned to interdict or threaten the sea lanes connecting the United States to Australia and New Zealand, represented exactly the kind of strategic foothold American planners believed could not be allowed to become fully operational, a calculation that drove the decision to act with resources and preparation time that, under less urgent circumstances, no responsible commander would have considered adequate for an opposed amphibious landing. The decision to invade Guadalcanal in August of 1942 came together with a speed and a level of improvisation that reflected just how urgently American commanders felt they needed to act. Intelligence reports indicated Japanese forces were constructing an airfield on the island, a base that, if completed and operational, would threaten the supply and communication lines running between the United States and Australia at a moment when Australia's own security still felt genuinely uncertain. American planners, working with incomplete maps, limited reconnaissance, and a logistics pipeline still being built from scratch this early in the war, assembled the landing force so hastily that the operation was informally nicknamed Operation Shoestring by the men involved, a name that captured both the urgency behind the decision and the threadbare resources actually available to carry it out. The initial landing on August 7th caught Japanese defenders on the island genuinely by surprise, and Marines secured the nearly completed airfield, soon renamed Henderson Field after a Marine aviator killed at Midway, with relatively light resistance in the operation's opening hours. This early success, however, created a dangerous illusion of how the broader campaign might unfold, an illusion that the disaster at Savo Island just 2 nights later would shatter completely. The 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General General Vandegrift, had trained for the landing under compressed timelines that left little opportunity for the kind of rehearsal and logistical fine-tuning later Pacific operations would benefit from. A reflection of how quickly the entire operation had been assembled once intelligence about the Japanese airfield construction reached American commanders. Vandegrift himself later described the operation's planning phase as one of the most rushed and improvised of his entire career, an assessment that historians studying the campaign's opening weeks have consistently validated, given how quickly the initial tactical advantage of surprise gave way to the desperate, resource-constrained defense that would characterize most of the following 6 months. The Battle of Savo Island, fought in the early hours of August 9th, remains one of the most lopsided defeats in the history of the United States Navy. A nighttime surface engagement in which a Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa caught the Allied screening force protecting the landing area almost completely unprepared, sinking 4 heavy cruisers in a chaotic, close-range action, lasting barely more than half an hour. The scale and speed of the defeat forced Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the carrier task force providing air cover for the operation, to withdraw his ships from the area to avoid further losses, a decision made independently of the ground situation ashore, and one that left the newly landed Marines without the naval protection, and, critically, the supply ships still carrying much of their equipment, food, and ammunition. Mikawa's tactical decision not to press his advantage further that night, choosing to withdraw his cruiser force after destroying the Allied screening ships rather than continuing on to attack the still largely unprotected transport ships carrying the Marines' remaining supplies and equipment, has remained one of the most debated tactical choices of the entire Pacific War. Had Mikawa pressed the attack against the transports directly, the material losses inflicted on the landing force could plausibly have been severe enough to force an early withdrawal from the island entirely. A counterfactual that historians studying the battle continue to weigh carefully, given how narrow the actual margin between disaster and eventual American success on Guadalcanal genuinely was in the campaign's opening days. This is the detail that turned Guadalcanal from a conventional amphibious operation into something closer to a desperate siege. Marines ashore found themselves holding a captured airfield with only a fraction of the supplies originally intended for the operation, cut off from reliable resupply for weeks at a stretch, while Japanese naval forces, controlling the surrounding waters at night through a resupply and reinforcement effort American sailors nicknamed the Tokyo Express, continued landing fresh troops and equipment for the counterattacks Japanese commanders were already planning to retake the airfield. The air war fought over Guadalcanal, conducted by a scratch collection of Marine, Navy, and Army aircraft operating out of Henderson Field that pilots nicknamed the Cactus Air Force, played an equally critical role in the campaign's overall outcome, providing the air cover that made it possible to contest Japanese naval reinforcement runs and, at least partially, offset the American carrier withdrawal that had followed the disaster at Savo Island. Pilots flying from Henderson Field operated under conditions nearly as harsh as the infantry holding the perimeter around them, frequently taking off and landing on a runway subjected to regular Japanese naval bombardment and air raids, flying missions in aircraft that were themselves in chronically short supply of spare parts, and replacement pilots throughout much of the campaign's most difficult stretch. Stop and consider what 6 months of this actually meant for the individual Marine holding the perimeter around Henderson Field, because the tactical situation bore almost no resemblance to a conventional, well-supplied military campaign. Food shortages became severe enough, especially in the campaign's early months, that Marines subsisted for extended periods on captured Japanese rice stores and severely reduced rations, malnutrition compounding the physical toll of continuous combat and the tropical climate, in ways that left men in a state of chronic exhaustion even between actual engagements. Malaria and other tropical diseases spread through the perimeter with a speed and severity that some historians studying the campaign have argued incapacitated more men on both sides than combat itself did, a silent, grinding attrition that ran alongside the more visible fighting for the entire duration of the campaign. The specific nickname Marines gave the island during this period, Starvation Island, reflected a reality that went beyond ordinary combat hardship into genuine, sustained physical deprivation, with some units reduced to a fraction of standard daily caloric intake for weeks at a stretch, a condition that left men measurably weaker and slower to recover from wounds or illness than better supplied troops in later Pacific campaigns would experience. Quartermaster officers, struggling to maintain even minimal supply levels, described the campaign's early logistics situation as barely functional, dependent on irregular resupply runs that could be, and frequently were, disrupted by Japanese naval activity in the surrounding waters, leaving frontline units to stretch whatever rations happened to arrive across far longer periods than any standard supply doctrine would have considered acceptable. The land battles fought to hold the perimeter around Henderson Field, including the fighting at the Tenaru River in August, and the desperate defense of what became known as Bloody Ridge in September, tested the thinly stretched Marine defenses against determined and often numerically superior Japanese assaults, engagements in which individual acts of extraordinary endurance and improvisation repeatedly made the difference between the perimeter holding and collapsing entirely. The fighting at what became known as Bloody Ridge in September, a sustained Japanese assault against Marine positions defending Henderson Field's most vulnerable approach, brought Japanese forces close enough to overrunning the airfield entirely that several accounts from Marines present during the battle described genuine uncertainty, in the moment, about whether the defense would actually hold through the night. Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the Marine Raider and parachute units defending the ridge, organized a defense under conditions of severe troop shortage and near-constant Japanese pressure that historians studying the campaign have consistently identified as one of the single most critical individual engagements of the entire six-month campaign. A battle whose outcome, had it gone differently, could plausibly have ended the campaign in Japan's favor at a point when American reinforcement and resupply capacity remained severely constrained. Sergeant John Basilone, defending a critical section of the line during the fighting for Henderson Field in October, personally kept multiple machine gun positions operational through a sustained Japanese assault, actions that earned him the Medal of Honor and that illustrate the kind of individual, desperate improvisation the campaign repeatedly demanded from the men holding the line. Basilone's own actions during the October fighting for Henderson Field illustrate exactly the kind of desperate improvisation the campaign repeatedly demanded from individual Marines holding thinly stretched defensive lines. With most of his machine gun section either killed or wounded during a sustained Japanese assault, Basilone personally moved between multiple gun positions, repairing damaged weapons and keeping fire directed at attacking Japanese forces for an extended period, under conditions that left him operating largely alone against what documented accounts describe as a numerically overwhelming assault, actions that directly prevented a breach in the Marine line at a moment when reserves to plug such a breach were not readily available. Basilone would go on to survive Guadalcanal, tour the United States as a celebrated war hero and war bond spokesman not unlike the Iwo Jima flag raisers would experience years later, and eventually request a return to combat duty, ultimately being killed during the landing at Iwo Jima in February of 1945, a death that closed out one of the more celebrated individual combat records of the entire Pacific War. Japanese commanders initially and persistently underestimated the scale of the American commitment to holding Guadalcanal, a miscalculation that led to a pattern of piecemeal reinforcement rather than the single overwhelming counterattack that might have had a genuine chance of retaking the airfield before American strength on the island grew too substantial to dislodge. Successive Japanese assaults throughout August, September, and October were launched with forces that, while individually committed and often fought with extraordinary determination, were consistently insufficient in scale to overcome the Marine defenses, a pattern that gradually drained Japanese military resources on the island and in the surrounding waters, without ever achieving the decisive breakthrough Japanese planners kept believing the next reinforcement effort would deliver. Japanese ground commanders who led the successive counterattacks against the Marine perimeter operated under a persistent cultural and doctrinal assumption, shared broadly across the Japanese military establishment at this stage of the war, that determined infantry assault, executed with sufficient aggression and willingness to accept casualties, could overcome material and numerical disadvantages that a more purely resource-based calculation would have suggested were insurmountable. This assumption, which had proven at least partially valid during Japan's rapid early conquests across Southeast Asia, against less prepared and less motivated defenders, ran directly into the reality of well-entrenched marine positions, supported by artillery and the Cactus Air Force's air cover, that inflicted casualty rates on attacking Japanese infantry, that these successive assaults simply could not sustain over the campaign's extended duration. This underestimation reflected a broader and, in retrospect, costly Japanese assumption that American forces, having suffered the humiliating naval defeat at Savo Island, might simply withdraw from the island rather than commit to the kind of extended, grinding campaign the fighting actually became. Japanese naval and ground commanders continued feeding reinforcements into the campaign through the Tokyo Express resupply runs for months, a strategy that, rather than overwhelming the American position through decisive force, instead committed Japan to a prolonged war of attrition that steadily consumed exactly the kind of experienced pilots, sailors, and infantry that Japan, unlike the United States, had no comparable industrial and training pipeline to replace at the same rate. Japanese naval and army planners also consistently underestimated the industrial and logistical resilience the United States could bring to bear, even in a theater as geographically remote as the South Pacific, a miscalculation reflecting broader Japanese assumptions about American resolve and capacity that would prove costly across the entire remaining course of the war, not merely at Guadalcanal specifically. Each successive Japanese reinforcement effort, planned around the expectation that the current commitment of troops and ships would prove sufficient to finally overwhelm the American position, instead encountered a defending force that, however severely strained by supply shortages and disease in the campaign's early months, steadily grew stronger as American logistics improved and additional units became available for rotation into the fighting. The naval battles fought in the waters surrounding Guadalcanal throughout the campaign, so frequent and so intense that the channel between the island and its neighbors became known among sailors on both sides as Iron Bottom Sound, for the sheer number of warships sunk there, reached their decisive culmination in the naval battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November of 1942. A sustained, multi-day series of engagements in which American naval forces, despite serious losses of their own, successfully prevented Japanese battleships from bombarding Henderson Field into uselessness and blocked a major Japanese troop reinforcement convoy from landing intact. This battle, more than any single engagement before it, marked the point at which Japan's ability to contest control of the waters around Guadalcanal, and therefore its ability to meaningfully reinforce or resupply its ground forces on the island, began an irreversible decline. The naval battle of Guadalcanal itself unfolded across multiple distinct engagements over several days in mid-November, including a brutal, close-range night action on November 13th, in which American cruisers and destroyers, badly outnumbered and outgunned by the Japanese battleship force they encountered, fought at ranges so close that the two fleets were, according to several surviving accounts, essentially firing directly into each other in near-total darkness and confusion, a chaotic engagement that inflicted severe losses on both sides, but that ultimately succeeded in its critical strategic purpose of preventing Japanese battleships from reaching Henderson Field to bombard it into ineffectiveness ahead of a planned major troop landing. The Sullivan brothers, 5 siblings serving together aboard the light cruiser USS Juno, were among those killed when the ship was torpedoed and sunk during this same battle, a loss that, once known publicly, prompted the United States military to revise its policies regarding family members serving together aboard the same vessel. By January of 1943, with Japanese forces on the island reduced by combat losses, starvation, and disease to a fraction of their original strength, and with American forces ashore now substantially reinforced and resupplied compared to the desperate early months of the campaign, Japanese commanders made the decision to evacuate their remaining troops rather than continue committing forces to a campaign that had become strategically unwinnable. This evacuation, conducted with skill and completed successfully in February of 1943, represented the first major Japanese ground force withdrawal of the entire Pacific War, a symbolic and strategic turning point that historians studying the war's overall trajectory consistently identify, alongside the naval defeat at Midway 7 months earlier, as marking the definitive end of Japan's expansionist phase and the beginning of the long American pushback across the Pacific toward the home islands themselves. Operation K, the codename Japanese planners assigned to the evacuation effort, was conducted with a level of tactical deception and precision that surprised American commanders, who did not immediately recognize that the pattern of Japanese naval activity they were observing represented a withdrawal rather than preparation for yet another reinforcement effort, allowing a substantial portion of the remaining Japanese garrison to be extracted successfully before American forces fully grasped what was actually happening. This successful evacuation, while representing a clear strategic defeat in terms of Japan's failure to hold the island, also demonstrated a level of operational skill in conducting a fighting withdrawal under difficult circumstances that several historians studying the campaign have noted as a genuine, if ultimately insufficient, Japanese military achievement in the campaign's closing weeks. Journalist and later novelist Robert Leckie, who served in the campaign as an infantryman and later published one of the most widely read first-hand memoirs of the Pacific War, described Guadalcanal in terms that emphasized precisely this gap between the campaign's later historical reputation as a foregone strategic success and the genuine, sustained uncertainty the men fighting it actually experienced month after month. A literary account that, alongside Eugene Sledge's later memoir of Peleliu and Okinawa, became one of the primary first-hand sources through which subsequent generations came to understand the specific, granular experience of infantry combat in the Pacific theater. For the Marines who survived the 6-month campaign, the physical toll extended well beyond the combat wounds most conventional accounts of the fighting emphasize. Post-war veterans' reunions and oral history projects specifically focused on Guadalcanal survivors, conducted in the decades following the war, consistently documented this recurring physical legacy alongside the psychological weight of the campaign, with a substantial proportion of interviewed veterans reporting ongoing malaria-related health issues that persisted for years or even decades after their actual combat service on the island had ended. A medical footprint of the campaign that extended the human cost of Guadalcanal far beyond the 6 months of active fighting itself. Malaria in particular followed many Guadalcanal veterans home, a chronic condition that continued to produce recurring fevers and debilitating symptoms for years after the men themselves had left the island. A lingering physical legacy of the campaign's severe disease environment that several post-war medical studies specifically tracked among veterans of this particular campaign, given how thoroughly malaria had spread through the perimeter during the fighting's worst months. Survivors also carried forward the specific psychological weight of having fought a campaign whose outcome, for much of its actual duration, felt genuinely uncertain, a contrast to how the campaign is often remembered today as a clear and inevitable American strategic success, a hindsight framing that several Guadalcanal veterans, in later interviews, pushed back against directly, describing months of the campaign during which neither side could be confident the Americans would actually hold the island at all. Medical officers who served through the campaign's worst disease outbreaks developed treatment and prevention protocols under conditions of severe medication shortage, particularly for malaria specifically, that later informed broader American military medical planning for subsequent tropical Pacific campaigns. a hard-won body of practical medical knowledge purchased at the cost of the widespread illness that had afflicted Guadalcanal's defenders through most of the campaign's duration. The specific combination of combat casualties and disease-related losses experienced during this campaign prompted a broader reassessment within American military medical planning of how thoroughly tropical disease prevention needed to be integrated into every subsequent Pacific operations logistics planning from the outset, rather than treated as a secondary concern behind combat supply and ammunition. The tactical and logistical lessons drawn from Guadalcanal's improvised, under-resourced opening months directly shaped how the United States approached every subsequent Pacific Island campaign, establishing more rigorous standards for supply planning, naval escort commitment, and close air support coordination that reflected hard lessons paid for, with exactly the kind of desperate, threadbare margins that had nearly cost the Marines the airfield entirely in the campaign's earliest and most dangerous weeks. Admiral William Halsey, who took command of American naval forces in the South Pacific Theater partway through the campaign, at a moment widely regarded as one of its most critical and uncertain, brought an aggressive command style that several historians credit with meaningfully improving American naval coordination and morale during the campaign's difficult middle months, a leadership change that arrived at almost exactly the moment the naval battle of Guadalcanal was about to decide the campaign's ultimate trajectory. The campaign also established the basic template for the island-hopping strategy that would define the remainder of the Pacific War, proving that American forces could seize and hold a contested Japanese position even under severely constrained logistical conditions, a proof of concept that shaped strategic planning confidence for the much larger campaigns still to come at places like Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. Remember the question this story opened with: how do you hold a jungle airfield for 6 months when the Navy that put you there has been driven off and your supplies are running out? The honest answer, drawn from the campaign's full 6-month arc, is that you hold it through exactly the combination this story has traced. Individual acts of desperate improvisation at the perimeter, a scratch Air Force flying from a battered runway, a Navy willing to keep fighting and dying in the waters offshore even after a catastrophic opening defeat, and an industrial base back home that could keep replacing losses faster than Japan's could. A compounding advantage that took 6 brutal months to fully assert itself, but that, once it did, never again allowed Japan to seriously contest which side actually controlled the pace and direction of the Pacific War. If you want to understand how a hastily planned, under-resourced landing on a jungle island nearly collapsed within days of the worst naval defeat in American history, and how the Marines who held on anyway turned 6 desperate months into the campaign that started Japan's long retreat, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.